Today we will be talking about lethal injection, but what is lethal injection? It is a method of the death penalty that was created in the 1970s but has been commonly used since the 1990s. It involves a 3-drug cocktail. The first drug is sodium thipental, which puts the individual unconscious. The second drug is alkyrium bromide, which paralyzes them. And the third is potassium chloride, which puts them in a cardiac arrest and eventually kills them. Correctional officers administer the drugs into the inmates' veins and wait for them to pass within minutes. Since its creation, pharmacies in the United States and Europe have been banning the primary drugs used in lethal injection, making states use other drug alternatives. 8 states have been using a 1-drug process, while other states have been switching the first drug used within the usual 3 being administered, using pentobarbital, midazolam, or fentanyl as the sedative. While the drugs for execution are only $90, the executions themselves can cost up to $1 million. This is 50 to 70% more than the capital cases where a defense attorney does not seek the death penalty. These costs vary from state to state. For example, in Nebraska, an economics teacher did a study that found the state spends $14.6 million per year to maintain its capital punishment system, while in Pennsylvania, the Eagle Reading found data that calculated the cost of sentencing 408 people to death was an estimated $816 million higher than the cost of life without parole. Other methods such as firing squad, hanging, electric chair, and gas chamber were primary use of capital punishment until the lethal injection became available around the country when Texas first used this method of execution in 1982. Since its creation, it has been so widely used that it has been adopted by many countries such as China, Thailand, Guatemala, and the Philippines. Lethal injection has become the most used method of execution after it is seen as the most ethical and humane way of using the death penalty compared to the other methods. But is it really ethical?
Lethal injection was introduced as the more humane method of execution in Oklahoma during the year 1977. It was cheaper than all other methods of execution and seen as more humane due to the sedatives in the drug cocktail. Texas was the first state to administer a dose of lethal injection when executing Charles Brooks Jr. in 1982. This has since become the most common method of execution, with new studies proving that lethal injection is in fact not painless. The question of how humane lethal injection is has become a topic of discussion. I would challenge this question with another question. If given the choice, from what method would you choose to be executed from? The drugs that make up lethal injection are not expensive in itself. However, the process of execution is extremely expensive, costing upwards to millions of dollars over the course of an inmate's stay on death row. According to Death Penalty Information Center, a 2016 study on Oregon found that the state spent on an average of $2.3 million on 61 death row inmates leading up to their execution, while the same state spent $1.4 million for over 300 murder cases. This isn't the only state where the price of execution is far more than anything else in the budget. According to the same site, Pennsylvania has spent $272 million. Also, according to our group's survey, most people assume that executions are not expensive at all, while in reality they take up a huge portion of the budget. This goes to show that many people in our society don't know the true cost of the death penalty.
It is an undisputed fact that lethal injection is publicly viewed as the most ethical way of execution pertaining to capital punishment. But why? This form of execution is seen more as a medical procedure than it does as a form of capital punishment, so in other terms, it looks nicer. It is a lot less gruesome and shows a more favorable ending to the life of the inmate, but what do we know about the pain felt while being injected with these chemicals? From the introduction of lethal injection all the way to current-day America, it has been publicly accepted that lethal injection is the most humane way to execute an inmate. The question is that true? Evidence has been mounting against the idea that lethal injections are painless over the past few years, with autopsies done on the bodies. They have found that bodies show signs of drowning or suffocation in response to the drugs after the anesthetic sets in. The issue with anesthesia is your muscles are paralyzed, and despite feeling everything, you are unable to express any pain because all muscle movements are restrained. Research finds that this closely resembles waterboarding, which is a banned torture technique in America. It is deemed that firing squads are simply the most painless way to go due to the instantaneous death followed instead of prolonged torture on a gurney by lethal injection. An actual example of this is the case of Thomas D. Arthur, convicted of murder in 1982, who argued that if he were to be executed, he would choose the form of firing squad over lethal injection. He stated he did not want to be the latest in a series of death row prisoners who have appeared to suffer for extended periods of time during their injections. So overall, there are distinctive arguments for both sides. The explicit positives for lethal injection agreed upon in society are the ideas that lethal injection is more economically sound, that it is painless, and that society is more pleased with the visual of lethal injection over options like firing squad or the electrical chair. The negatives of lethal injection are that it is not actually cheaper in the long run, and that in some cases it actually shows to bring more suffering than other options.
All right. Good evening, Glenn. You mind just introducing yourself real quick?
Yeah, Glenn DeFay. I was a warden, level 1 warden at Rikers Island, 1990 to 2015. I also have a master's degree in that field and human resource management. And before that, I was in the Marine Corps, and I'm here to help Bailey O'Brien with any questions he has.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So I know, working in New York, death penalty, isn't a thing over there. But having all this experience, being a level 1 warden, having those years of experience, what can what's your opinion on lethal injection? Do you think it's a humane practice? Do you think, there could be possible other ways, of execution that maybe are, more humane or, maybe less painful. I know it's execution. It's probably, you're getting sentenced to death. It might be painful anyway, but, what's your opinion on that?
I'll give you one of the cases that I had, and I don't remember the inmate's first name, but his last name was Mean. They actually called him the real Hannibal Lecter. And if you ever watched the movie Silence of the Lambs,
Yes, I have.
This was in a prisoner who was being extradited, and he committed the crimes from the 70s, even though he was captured in the 90s. And he was being sent back to a state like Florida because he committed multiple crimes to different states. So he was under my jurisdiction. So basically, if New York doesn't fight the jurisdiction and sends him back to a capital punishment state like Florida or Texas, you basically send them back there to get executed. So as a warden, I'll explain what this inmate did, and then it'll probably sway anybody's opinion. Right. So this was probably one of the most heinous criminals that I ever saw. So what he would do is he would have a Volkswagen. A lot of people don't remember it, but Volkswagen used to make a minivan. And he would go to parks and he would lure handicapped females, the age between 8 and 13 years old. And he was being prosecuted for rape and dismemberment of young handicapped teens between, from 13 all the way down to adolescents of 8 years old. And then after he would rape them and lure them to a van, he would dismember their bodies and cut their bodies up and put them in glass jars. And when he was caught, it was a big controversy because in New York, which used to be a death capital punishment state by lethal injection. I don't know if they had lethal injection, but I knew they had the electric chair, which was probably ruled out. There was very few people, including usually when these high profile cases come, these inmates, people don't realize, unless you go to a state like Texas, which is probably the fastest state to capital punishment, death or capital punishment cases, especially by lethal injection, which is probably the most humane way of putting somebody to death, could take up to 20 years because there'll be appeals and reappeals. And even though these inmates, they're destitute and they may not have money to provide that legal defense, they are afforded probably the best lawyers who work pro bono, and they work for free, constitutional experts, to ensure that these inmates have been given every right. But in a case like this, where it was so heinous, even lawyers didn't want to represent this person. So not too many people fought his extradition, and he was extradited. And I don't know his total outcome. I never followed the case through because when you start dealing with thousands upon thousands upon thousands of inmates, you don't take it personal. But in a case like that, I would definitely believe in a capital punishment case where it's ironclad, where the person admits to it, is caught doing it, and the case is so heinous where the most reasonable person would say there's no chance of rehabilitation of this person.
Right.
But I don't know if I agree with it across the board because as a warden and throughout my history, I know that there's been innocent people convicted of crimes. But in a case that is 100%, proven by DNA, proven by science, the person admits to the crime, and it's such a heinous case where the person can't be rehabilitated, I do believe in it.
Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I was gonna ask you a question about, did you ever deal with like, the budget at your at Rikers?
Yes, believe it or not, most people think that a warden is, it's like the Green Mile where it's walking tears,
Mhm.
but the cost of an inmate and the cost of that's where I probably spent most of my time.
Right. Okay. So that is a huge side of being, a warden,
Yes.
especially one that was at like the prestige that you worked at, the level of of job. Um, so you probably didn't have to deal with anything regarding capital punishment in your budget, but you just having the experience of being a warden, maybe talking to other wardens in other states where the death penalty is legal. You know, what do you think? The economic side of lethal injection or maybe just execution in general, the death penalty in general, what do you think that does, to, not just our country as a whole, but, as states, like, is it expensive? Is it an economic burden, on individual states where the death penalty is legal?
Well, the correctional system, when I first came on the correctional system, I would say that the average cost of an inmate to house per year was 50,000. Today, for a year, it's probably closer to 150,000.
Right.
And then when you add on, the way the costs really balloon is because, like I told you in the beginning, uh, the arbitration of 20 years of legal appeals, and the inmate who's being put to death is always going to be given the best defense possible. So there's going to be pro bono constitutional lawyers and tons of appeals that are put against them. So it's the burden of the state and the government to prove the case and take it to appeal. So I would say it would run into anywhere from $5 to $20 million per execution.
Oh, okay.
If you calculate the time, the defense, the prosecution, and housing the inmate for all those years prior to that, because most likely that inmate's going to be put on death row or in separate isolation. It's going to be put on suicide watch. There's so many precautions that take with inmates. So if you just times the mere economics of $150,000 times whether it's 5 to 15 to 20 years of housing, plus the prosecution of him and everything that has been afforded along the way, I would say it would run into the millions.
In conclusion, lethal injection is seen as the most ethical method because its effects are less gruesome than other methods of execution, when in fact it is shown to cause just as much pain. It is shown to give effects of drowning and silencing the pain of death row inmates. Many capital punishment states are choosing other methods such as firing squad, as it is assumed to be less painful compared to the drugs being used. In the end, lethal injection is seen as the most ethically humane way of applying the death penalty in 31 states.